Part 17, Development of the Human Community. We convey to you a part of the sayings from Spiritual Energies with the topic, Development of the Human Community, by Aljibisa Stojanovic, who transferred the sayings received in deep meditation into the book, Man, Origin and Future. The beginning of the human community dates from 111,000 years ago. Before that, and from the beginning of contact with the spark of luminous bodies, people lived in smaller or larger families or groups that did not contain the characteristics of a human community. It was only when more families began to live together that the development of human community began. In the beginning, they were formed thanks to blood relations between families, but later, two or more families joined together in a larger human community that numbered from 50 to 200 people. In such a community, as in human history before the community, everything was shared, weapons and tools, women and children. Marriages did not exist, but women decided for themselves which man they would live with and for how long. Those contacts usually lasted from a few days to a few years, but never a lifetime. Children from such relationships were named after their mother, not their father. Fathers did not feel particularly attached to these children. The children grew up together, in a large group and had little contact with their parents. They were trained in hunting and war skills by experts appointed by the entire community. People lived without many worries, without fear, without struggle for power, without envy. Chronic diseases were very rare. They suffered from injuries received while hunting, from animals or from enemies. Children were born quite easily, with mothers taking a standing position, legs spread, usually against a tree or on all fours. Neither at birth, nor in childhood, the children had almost no trauma. There were no marital problems. If they did not agree, the partners simply parted ways. There was no struggle for power, because the power belonged to the tribal elder, and he was inherited, as a rule, by his son. The first, systematic negative emotions began to develop with the creation of the institution of marriage, which occurred about 98,000 years ago. Since then, the children, born in marriage, began to stay in the marriage union, and that's when the differences between the children began to emerge. Marriage unions are, in fact, egocentric embryos in the entire human community. Much later, about 60,000 years ago, there was the creation of private property over the means of production, weapons and tools, small plots of land for cultivation and livestock, but only among the most developed human communities, while the vast majority still lived in matrimonial or even lower from the marriage union. Nevertheless, it can be said that since 23,000 years ago, the largest number of human communities have switched to private property. Thanks to it, there was an accelerated development of individual human communities, because private property, ownership, encouraged individual people to make special efforts and engagements, which led to the general progress of the human community. As early as 16,000 years ago, there were highly developed human societies in the area of Australia, East Asia with the islands, and Central Africa. These civilizations corresponded to the level that the Sumerians had only 5,000 years BC. However, the highest level of civilization was achieved 14,000 years ago by the inhabitants of a large island, the size of Greenland, which was located 250 kilometers west of Africa, and its northeastern part is where the Canary Islands are now. It was the legendary Atlantis, whose civilization reached a level that was known to Egypt only 2,000 years before Christ. 12,000 years ago, there was a sudden subsidence of the Earth's crust, which swallowed Atlantis and all its inhabitants in just one night. This earthquake was not the result of any impact or the passage of celestial bodies by the Earth. The huge waves of the tide, which spread in all directions, destroyed almost all the inhabitants of England, the Atlantic coast of Europe and the Mediterranean Sea, and penetrated 500 kilometers into the depth of the African land. In this way, the traces of the culture of Atlantis were also destroyed, while the more remote areas, which were spared from the flood, had little contact with Atlantis. 7,000 years ago, culture flourished in Tibet, China and Mesopotamia. This time, a great flood, earthquakes and volcanoes, caused by the very close passage of a comet by the Earth's globe, created desolation on almost the entire Earth's surface. North America, Australia, Tibet, China, Japan and partially Mesopotamia were particularly affected by this. After that time, human civilization developed without major cataclysms. The legend of this flood found its place in the Bible, but the real truth about it is different. Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, at that time had the highest level of development in the world, with knowledge of pictorial writing and a developed irrigation system that enabled 3 harvests a year. One enlightened person found out about the flood in advance and managed to convince the local ruler to lead the entire population to the surrounding mountains, taking with him everything that was valuable, manuscripts and art objects, saving a huge cultural treasure from destruction. That person is a historical figure, but it was not Noah, nor did the people find salvation in Noah's Ark, but in the arduous climbing of the mountains, fleeing from the 15-meter-high wave that carried everything before it. They returned only after a few months, when the water receded and the soil dried. They found on their fertile fields a layer of silt 10 meters high. Most of the survivors moved to other areas, and those who remained took 15 years to rebuild the irrigation systems. The rest of the population of Mesopotamia, as well as many other primitive peoples from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, were wiped out by the flood. But already 7,000 years ago, all negative emotions existed in human society, deeply embedded, and then more and more mass diseases began to appear. In addition to chronic diseases, people died massively from various infections that found suitable soil in the organism, damaged by negative emotions, hatred, intolerance, struggle for power, envy, hundreds of thousands of slaves, huge differences between classes, eternal fear for the defense of the government, the struggle of the oppressed for their freedom and harassment from those who wanted to preserve power. Negative emotions and diseases among people have been raging continuously for thousands of years, reaching their peak during the last 1,000 years before Christ. Never, neither before nor after that, did such a small number of people who existed on earth, and especially in the Middle East where civilization was the most developed on average, reach such a high level of negative thoughts. Then the Creator, in order to save the aura of the earth that was damaged by people's negative thoughts, decided that, despite the fact that people were given free will, he indirectly influenced it in order to bring about an organized change in the way of thinking and to reduce negative thoughts to the minimum. The creative energy that permeates everything realized this idea through man, Christ. He managed to get the masses interested in religion, the basis of which was to change the way of thinking in such a way that negative thoughts would be reduced to a minimum, which should enable the reduction of diseases and damage to the Earth's aura. The culmination of his mission was the task of neutralizing the negative consequences of bad thoughts that have been accumulating for thousands of years by changing the frequency of energy in the Earth's aura, while not changing the frequencies of living beings and the material world on Earth. Thanks to this epoch-making act of his, humanity suddenly moved forward, but already in the Middle Ages, in the Christian world during the Inquisition, it experienced a significant setback. Today's way of life makes it possible to create a huge number of negative thoughts, and that only during one day. The treasury of sacred knowledge thanks you for your interest, and sends you a lot of spiritual patience and love.